Right, thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm Martin Hutchins. Welcome back to another PAS Fireside Chat. This is one of our regular gatherings of people from the world of planning, and I'm really pleased to say today that I've got Clllr James Denselow, the Chair of Planning at Brent, and Gerry Ansell, the Head of Planning at Brent. Now, a couple of weeks back, we helped Brent with a dry run of their planning committee, and yesterday evening they had their first sort of live proper committee. So I thought it'd be quite interesting to talk to Gerry and James about their experiences. And I'm going to ask James, if you don't mind coming in first. So last night was the first live committee. First of all, from your perspective, how did it go? How did it feel? And what were your key learning points, would you say, from last night?
Well, I think it went well in the sense that, yes, this is a new format, and it's a significant departure for us as an organisation to be doing these. But I feel that it captured the essence of what the meetings normally are. So it didn't feel like a very alien experience to our normal planning meetings. I think it helped a lot having done a test meeting, and I think that was very helpful for people to get, certainly for councillors, to get kind of familiar with the technology and how it works and how the sort of conversation and the cadence of the meeting would happen. I think obviously there's a lot of preparation from an officer's perspective that Gerry can speak to that went on behind the scenes to make sure that everything was being thought of. I mean, there's some sort of meta questions around accessibility and equality assessments and what have you, but I hope that that we can get better at this. I feel that it wasn't a million miles off how things normally operate last night. I feel it's a bit longer than normal because things do take a bit longer. There's sort of more sort of delays and the kind of pace of the meeting is slower, but I don't think we lose any of the essence of scrutiny within the format itself. So, I mean, as someone who's been doing virtual meetings in other roles for a while now, I know this is a sort of enforced on us by what's happened around the coronavirus, but I feel that we're adapting pretty well, and I hope we can learn many lessons that can help us continue to improve the format. So regardless of whether we have a coronavirus pandemic or not, this is something that we can really think about when it comes to council business going forward.
So it might become part of the normal way of doing things post-COVID, is that?
Well, I think it might become part of it. I mean, I'm really conscious that when we're talking about certainly the equality assessments, there's obviously the concern about members of the public not being able to address the committee in ways they traditionally do. I think there's a flip side of that, which is a lot of people who would want to address the planning committee but don't want to spend their entire evening doing so. It's the sort of the modern age demand of our residents, and if they can dial in for a half an hour or 10 minutes just to make their kind of points known from the comfort of their own living room, I think that's gives a greater level of democracy to our committee proceedings. So I think that's something for the future, actually, how we capture the positives while protecting the sort of ways of working that traditionally have governed the committee going forward. Yeah,
excellent, thank you. And how about you, Gerry? How did it go last night from your perspective?
I feel it went really well. For me, there was a lot of preparation that went in to it, and obviously we've done some testing at various stages. There was a balance really to be struck in terms of providing adequate security for the meeting, because we used the Zoom platform, and there have been some stories about some horrible things happening where meetings have been hijacked.
You ensure the security? What did you
Well,
do?
there were several things that we did and through the testing, but I'll just complete the other side of what I was saying was the balance, was to create the balance of security with good participation. And my feeling was that we got it right. And some of the things we did, we had a waiting room for participants. We also put them on audio rather than visual. And I felt that worked quite well. I think the pace of the meeting was it was a good pace, and I think the participation was good. My feeling was that, as we have with the conventional committee, there was a thorough discussion of all of the issues. We did have one or two glitches with the people dropping out on occasion, but I think that was coped with very well. I think Clllr Denselow was able to keep that pace of meeting, and we were able to kind of reassure that, because I was sitting amongst, I was actually present in the Civic Centre with colleagues from the committee services. We could communicate with each other and enable people into the meeting where calls might have been dropped. And I think that worked quite well. The other thing was that where people are speaking, what we try to do is encourage them to provide us with the script of what they're going to say. So if there is a dropout, then as a sort of a last resort, we can get their comments read out.
That's the public speakers.
The public speakers, that's right.
Yeah. And that's an important point, because I think it's not just about the council getting its systems and its kind of procedures and up and running. It's about the public getting used to how we do things, right? So I think there's another part of this to come in the future, which is more feedback from our residents as to how they feel these meetings could work best for them. Because I think that's something we've obviously been focusing on, getting our internal house in order. We've learned through the trial, small things like making sure all officers have and councillors have the right audio equipment, the right sort of chargers to make sure that technology doesn't fail 3 hours into a 4-hour meeting. I think we learned yesterday that obviously having an officer who's our transport expert not perhaps have the best connection at a key point of the debate around transport does slow the meeting down. I feel that what we had to do is simply repeat things, and as a chair I had maybe a sort of more air traffic controlling duty than I would in a normal planning meeting perhaps, just to make sure that members had clearly heard everything. So I think that's the critical difference. If you look at the voting, the first thing we do before we vote on any application is just make sure that all members can confirm they've heard the proceedings and feel fully informed to be able to make a decision whichever way it is at the end of the application.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned sound dropping in and out. I think, I've never been a planning chair, but I imagine that ability to summarise, if you like, what's just been said, if not everyone heard it, it's probably quite, I don't know, was that a new thing, or do you tend to do that anyway as part of your chairing role? Was there any sort of new skills you think you've had to develop in this area?
Yeah, no, I do think it is slightly a new one, in the sense that, and again, I think the trial did teach us a lot of the hiccups and the problems with things. And I think we're lucky, and I was saying this to Gerry before, we're lucky that we've got a committee that's fairly experienced. So they're not sort of new to being on the planning committee. And I think that does make a difference. They're kind of confident in how the meetings tend to run. And unlike other council meetings, actually, and I've been on lots of council committees in my 10 years as a councillor, the planning committee actually does have a sort of format that is pretty kind of standard, if you will. The debate within the format can obviously be very, very different, but the format itself is quite similar. So I think people are familiar with that, and using new technology with a familiar format is really helpful. But I think that, for me, the biggest kind of takeaway, which is perhaps not what on technology or just meeting organisation, perhaps is more of a kind of a macro challenge, and this doesn't necessarily reflect on the items we discussed and agreed or didn't agree on yesterday, which is that I always say councillors are double-hatted. We are corporate representatives of the council, elected representatives of the council, and we're obviously representatives of our residents and residents ourselves, and we wear those two hats. And often there is a tension between those two hats when we make our decisions. And I feel in the format, the virtual format, where members are sitting at home making decisions, there perhaps is a tendency to sort of think first and foremost or there's perhaps a bigger drag on your feeling as I'm a resident versus I'm a councillor as a member of a committee. I think that is something that is perhaps more of a cultural shift that will take a bit more time and familiarity with the format to overcome. I think it's hard to put your finger on it because it's less about the applications, but I do feel that will be something, I speak from a member's perspective, that we have to kind of grapple with going forward. But compared to the surroundings of the council chamber, there's nothing more kind of being in the cockpit of the council than being right in the sort of that room, surrounded in this horseshoe format with all the officers, all the trappings of the council sort of infrastructure around you, and then to transfer from there to your garden in some cases is it's a very different experience, and I think we should be sensitive to the sort of impacts environment has on people in their, whether, as you say, in their day-to-day work or in kind of more kind of high octane things like a planning committee meeting.
Yeah, I agree with that. The tone of the meeting, I think we did work quite hard to try and set that tone so that it was as much like a conventional committee as possible, but mindful of the fact that most of us were sitting in their own houses. I was actually in the office, but all the staff were dress professionally, and certainly we asked that you just imagine you're actually sitting in the committee room when you're addressing the committee meeting. And to my mind, that worked extremely well. One of the things that I think is quite a difficult one, I think where the chair and it often has, I feel chair has to work quite hard at, is you miss all the social cues where, although we can all see each other, you're only looking at a screen, and to mention something to a colleague to the side of you, I'm thinking about housekeeping things and keeping things going, isn't really there. And you have to work quite hard in terms of trying to keep the communication going so everybody's up to speed with what's going on. And if there is, you do sometimes get those moments when there's a question asked and there's a series of blank faces and who's going to answer that. We did get through it quite well, but those social cues are not always there, and I think it's something you kind of need to get used to.
Yeah, and going back to that balance issue, I do think, unlike lots of other committees I've been on, because planning is sort of so uniquely kind of set up in terms of the policies that we operate to, I think officer involvement in planning committee meetings is a lot higher than in lots of other committees, and I think in the virtual format, the discussion, there's a danger that the discussion becomes so heavily member focused, because it's harder for officers to come into that discussion as they would if it was in a physical meeting. And I think we need to think about that as well, because, you know, is it suitable and right for, we had sort of certain senior officers sort of jumping in, should they be sort of electronically raising their hands like members do? And again, that comes back to Gerry's point about sort of how we read a meeting and the social cues rather than just the technology. So I think there's lots of learning. I mean, the big learnings are always the obvious ones, that we kind of can hear each other and we can kind of feel we get to a point where we're making a decision that is not a million miles away from how we would normally do things. But I think there's loads of subtleties that we need to now digest and think about, having done 2 of these as we go into to June's meeting.
Yeah.
So one other small point I want to make is that with conducting the meeting from, say, your own home, some people are not comfortable with that, you know, sort of letting, in effect, letting people into your home. And some people were able to put background pictures up to screen that. And that's something we're perhaps experimenting a little bit with. But I think that isn't it a point that there's a sense of adaptability that, you know, you want your own personal privacy respected, but obviously you want to participate in the meeting in it, you know, as formal a way as it should be. And I think that's kind of an interesting thing that we need to kind of be sensitive to as well.
Have you had any feedback from members and officers about how it went last night?
I personally, I have had some feedback, and the general consensus is that it went well, and we have a few learning points. But the meeting covered all of the issues. People felt that it was similar to a conventional committee. I think there was a lot of good humour in terms of trying to deal with particular issues as we went on, and I think it helped. I think the tone of the meeting was right. It felt like a professional. It's a quasi judicial body, and it had the right tone. That was my feeling, and certainly that's the feedback I've had.
I think we didn't. I mean, there's no one can accuse us of having a nice, easy softball committee for the first one done officially online. I think we had a very meaty committee. It would have been even more meaty if the 4th item had been on the agenda, with one item that had been deferred because of members previously rejecting it, and a very contested item that you listened in on the first item, which took 2 hours to go through. So I think it's interesting that a lot of those who were, the first application obviously was deferred. A lot of those who were opposing that item from the public perspective challenged us on the format and the fact we should be having a meeting in and of itself initially. And now in retrospect, there's very little challenge of that, which I think obviously they got the result that they wanted. But I think you know, the fact is that the format of the meeting didn't sway it either way, I would say. So I think that's a good sign in terms of, you know, the feedback we have from the people who are kind of rightly scrutinizing us from a public perspective too.
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was interesting. You mentioned earlier that I think it was the transport guy dropped in and out quite a bit, and I thought you did a good job of acknowledging that and summarising the points that he was making, because a lot of councillors were saying, "Oh, I didn't quite catch that." So brilliant. That's all really interesting. The last thing I want to ask you is if for colleagues, chairs of planning out there, James, and heads of planning getting ready for their first one. What's the one or two key things you'd encourage them to do as preparation for this? I mean, you've probably touched on it already, but just to re-emphasise.
I mean, from my perspective, I think it's obviously have a trial. Don't sort of just go straight into it in a sort of decision-making way. I think that gives everyone a lot of learnings and confidence for the real thing. I think have a lot of humility into it. I mean, don't pretend that all of a sudden the committee are digital experts and virtual meeting connoisseurs, and everyone will have a varying experience of the technology and perhaps doing these kind of meetings before. But I think just, Gerry mentioned good humor. I think people were, we've always said we're doing this because within this environment, other options could be to have full delegated authority to officers to make planning decisions or not make them at all. We're trying to maintain our kind of democratic scrutiny at a very difficult time. I think everyone realizes that. There's a lot of kind of, I hope, goodwill for us to try and do this the right way. I don't think this is an exercise in trying to sort of hide the council's decision making or to sort of bump through big decisions. Quite the opposite, in fact. So I think the good preparation, a lot of kind of technical work from officers will need to go into it, as done at Brent, but also that sense of don't pretend that everything is going to be fine. It's not about the Oscars. There will be hitches. There will be people who suddenly drop out. There will be things you can't even predict that will happen. But as long as you can keep to the core point, which is have members got to a point at the end of that item, having read a lot of paperwork, as we always do, and are very familiar with the application itself, feel they can get to a point, as they would in a physical meeting, that they can make the decisions they would normally make.
Thank you. And how about you, Gerry?
I think for me, it is the preparation. We started off with, I think, the philosophy of we want to run this as close as we possibly can to a conventional meeting. So that dictated a lot of the decisions that were made, particularly around the public participation. The security issue was something that we became conscious of very, very quickly. And we did look very carefully at what was happening in other authorities. The other thing that I'll say is that as well as the testing, I think is to have a team behind this, that you have backup. You think about all the things that could possibly go wrong, assume they are going to go wrong, and how you would deal with that. And I think having a mindset of things will go wrong, but we're going to fix them, we're going to roll with it, we're going to keep things going forward. And I think that's very, very important.
Okay, right. Well, look, thank you both. This, as I say, we're going to put this out via our newsletter next week. I think lots of councils are going to be really interested in your views. It's going to be really helpful to them. I think, we're really grateful for your time. So I'd just like to say thanks once again, and good luck with your future planning committees.
Thanks
See you
very
soon.
much.
Thank you.